Okay, good afternoon. We'll go ahead and get started. My name is Alfonso Oboehi, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the third annual Dean's Distinguished Lecture Program. As you probably know, the purpose of our Distinguished Lecture Series is to bring leading executives, policymakers, and recognized scholars to campus so they can come and share their insights, share ideas that can nourish us and hopefully inform us about what is going on. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to just recognize a few people in the audience. Dr. Tim Hines, our president. Dr. Hines. Okay. And also our provost, Dr. Michael Crafton. Dr. Crafton. I also want to recognize members of the... Okay. Thank you, okay. Where did that come from? I also want to recognize members of the College of Business Advisory Board. Could you please stand and be recognized, the folks who have supported me? Please, right here. Okay. Yeah. Thank you all. And also, we may have some members of the university's trustees. Could you please stand and be recognized? Trustees, yes, foundation trustees. Similarly, I want to extend a warm welcome to all of our special guests who have joined us from the community to be with us today. At this time, I'd like to formally introduce our speaker. Peter deSilva is President and Chief Operating Officer of UMB Financial Corporation. He is President of UMB Bank and Chairman of UMB Fund Services. He serves on UMB's Executive and Management Committees. Mr. deSilva has significant leadership and managerial experience across multiple areas of financial services, including strategy, sales, client services, operations, technology, and large-scale program management. He joined UMB in January 2004 and is directly responsible for UMB's revenue-producing business units and product lines, including Scout Investments, UMB Fund Services, UMB Financial Services, Consumer Banking, Global Asset Management, UMB Healthcare Services, and Payment Solutions. Mr. deSilva is an active member of the Greater Kansas City community. He sits on the board of the Civic Council of Greater Kansas City and Students in Free Enterprise. He is a trustee and chairman of the Trusteeship Committee of Park University and currently serves on the Kansas City Big Five program as the leader of the Entrepreneurial Initiative. He also sits on the board of trustees for MRI Global. Mr. deSilva volunteers as a team co-chair for Mayor Sly James's 2011 transition in Kansas City, Missouri. He serves as a co-chair and chair for various nonprofit annual fundraisers to support the American Heart Association, the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, Boy Scouts, Jewish Community Relations, Bureau American Jewish Committee, Boys and Girls Club, Rose Brooks University Academy, and the Starlight Theater. Mr. deSilva is a former board member of the United Way of Greater Kansas City, the Kansas City Symphony and Children's Incorporated. He is also past chairman of the Tocqueville Society and a past Kansas City campaign chair for the United Way of Greater Kansas City. He is a former chair of the board member, and executive committee member of the Greater Kansas City Chamber of Commerce. As a frequent guest speaker, Mr. deSilva focuses on recent economic crisis, leadership, and business ethics, and the importance of entrepreneurism. He has spoken at numerous universities, as he is here today, including University of Missouri, Kansas City, St. Louis, Missouri University, Rockhurst University, Park University, and William Jewell College in Kansas City. He has spoken to professional organizations such as the National Investment Company Service Association, the American Bankers Association, and recently he was selected actually to attend a 3-year Securities Industry Association Industry Leadership Program at the Wharton School of Business at University of Pennsylvania. He was a guest lecturer at the Fort Leavenworth Command and General Staff College Symposium, where his full paper was published in the final symposium report. Peter has been recognized for his professional and civic endeavors. In February 2012, he was profiled in Missouri Life magazine. In 2010, he made guest appearances on Fox Business discussing the economic crisis, financial regulation, and securities regulation. In 2007, Mr. deSilva was featured as one of Kansas City Business Journal's 10 People to Watch in 2007. In 2006, he was profiled in Bank Systems and Technology for Technology Innovation at UMB. In November 2005, Mr. deSilva was profiled in Business Week as one of the nation's Web Smart 50. Needless to say, he has been very much involved in his community. A native of Dartmouth, Massachusetts, Mr. deSilva earned a Bachelor of Science degree in Management from the University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth. He completed master-level coursework in Business Administration at the University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth, as well as at Bryant University College of Business in Lincoln, Rhode Island. Before joining UMB, he spent 16 years in the financial services industry, Fidelity Investments, in Boston, Cincinnati, New Hampshire, and with the last 7 years as Senior Vice President for Fidelity Brokerage Company. Peter lives in Kansas City, Missouri with his wife, Michelle, and their 2 daughters. It's a distinct honor and a pleasure to introduce Peter, who is my friend and a good buddy of mine. So, Peter deSilva.
Well, good afternoon. That's a little too long, Alfonso. I was actually born in 1961. You forgot to mention that. There's a few other details of my life I'd rather you not mention either. But all that having been said, it is a distinct honor and a distinct pleasure for me to be here today. When Alfonso and I reconnected after we knew each other at Park University for some time, he said, "I'm doing that Dean Distinguished Lecture Series again. Would you consider coming down to Atlanta?" And I said, "I love Atlanta. I'd love to come to Atlanta. Only 2 rules. Not while it's hot." So we passed that test today, for sure. And 2, I said, I need to put a whole day around it. And we have 3 big customers in Atlanta, so I came down and spent the day with them, and I'm spending the evening with you. So it's just delightful to be here with all of you. I, too, would like to thank Dr. Hines for having me, Provost Crofton for having me here today, and, of course, my good friend Alfonso. What a beautiful campus you guys have. I got to tell you, and I'm just being candid, when Alfonso and I talked about this, I didn't know anything about Clayton State University. Now I feel like I know a lot. I feel like I'm at home here, and just walking around with him today was just absolutely extraordinary. I'm not sure you appreciate, maybe you do, how lucky you are to have this wonderful institution right here in suburban Atlanta. Okay, so today, if you guys go ahead and throw up the slideshow here, make sure I can get it up.
An unrivaled prospect.
We're going to get to that. Somebody hit my page here. Okay, we're good. So, we're going to talk a little bit today about the U.S. economy. We're going to talk about how we got into the soup that we're in right now, which we are still in the soup, by the way. And we're going to talk a little bit about some roadways that we can maybe get out of this over the next couple of years. But I'm going to take us backwards before I take us forward. Because whenever I lecture on this topic of the economy, particularly in the last 3 or 4 years, what I find is very few people actually understand the precipitating actions and issues that cause us to be where we are today. So we're going to spend a little bit of time going backwards, but I promise we're going to go forward as well. So the first thing I want you to do is spend just a moment. We're going to watch a short video, about 3 minutes, and then I'll come back up and we'll talk some more about it.
Raised in unrivaled prosperity, we inherit an economy that is still the world's strongest, but is weakened by business failures, stagnant wages, increasing inequality, and deep divisions among our own people.
We allowed taxes and inflation to rob us of our earnings and savings, and watched the great industrial machine that had made us the most productive people on earth slow down and the number of unemployed increase.
We will reform Social Security and Medicare, sparing our children from struggles we have the power to prevent. And we will reduce taxes to recover the momentum of our economy and reward the effort and enterprise of working Americans.
The old solution, the old way, was to think that public money alone could end these problems. But we have learned that that is not so. And in any case, our funds are low. We have a deficit to bring down.
These things are old. These things are true. They have been the quiet force of progress throughout our history. What is demanded then is a return to these truths. What is required of us now is a new era of responsibility.
We must do what we know is right and do it with all our might. Let history say of us, these were golden years when the American Revolution was reborn, when freedom gained new life and America reached for her best.
5 presidents, 5 different commitments to solve the same problems, in essence. And yet today, those problems still persist. And in many respects, the problems that they were describing in one form or another are much worse off today than they were in the 80s and the 90s and in the early part of the 2000s. So again, we're going to explore how we get into this mess and what we might do to get out of it. I thought this was an interesting magazine cover from 1972. 1972, when Time magazine cost 50 cents. And the whole article talked about the United States going broke. Oh my goodness, what are we going to do? Well, 30 plus years later, we may be actually close to achieving what is being suggested here. We may be close to being broke. Now, I can tell you this, as a banker, I probably wouldn't make a loan to the U.S. government based upon the financial situation of our own government. But we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. So these problems aren't new. They've been around for quite some time, and we're going to explore them here as we go through our agenda today. So a couple of things we're going to do. How did we get here? Where are we now? What's my view on the world as we see it and some of the challenges that we still need to confront? We're going to give you our outlook. Our bank does a lot of work thinking about these economic matters, and we have an outlook for the next couple of years that I'd like to share with you. And then I want to talk about what are the catalysts, what are the things I'm watching and you should be watching that will help drive the economy forward or set us back if we don't resolve some of these issues. And then we're going to take your questions. I hope to wrap this up in give me 30 minutes or so, and then we'll have plenty of time for your questions when I'm done. So, if you like Shakespeare at all, you can see the little quote down the bottom, something's rotten in the state of Denmark. And indeed, something has been rotten in our economy. And it hasn't just been in the last few years, it's been for quite some time. So let me lay out for you the precipitating causes of the crisis that we have in front of us today. Number one, abundance of cheap capital. What do I mean by that? I mean that when the Fed drives interest rates to zero or near zero, it's real easy to take risks when the cost of capital is basically nothing. And we saw this happen. We've seen it happen a few times throughout history, but we saw it happen in particular after 9/11. And I'm going to come back to 9/11 because 9/11 was actually, in some ways, a very important event in the situation that we find ourselves in today. But when capital's cheap, it's easy to take risk and get a reasonable return on that capital. And it's arguable that capital has been too cheap for too long. Well, one of the things cheap capital will do is cause an asset bubble. And I like to call it that credit became like cash. Credit became currency over the last 10 years or so. And we had an asset bubble that was clearly unsustainable, starting in the early 2000s, working its way through the mid-2000s, culminating in housing, but not just housing. We had a financial asset bubble, we had a housing asset bubble, we had a land asset bubble, and that burst really hard in the fall of 2008, although as I'll show in a minute, it really started in 2007. This cheap cheap capital caused us to take imprudent risks as a society, both individually and collectively. And as a consequence, we had this asset bubble that burst very, very, very painfully in 2007, 2008. Now, this next issue is one I want you to think hard about. Because when I was growing up, my parents used to say to me, well, you don't want to have debt. Debt is a bad thing. And the more current generations, mine included, said, no, 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 no. I can have all the debt I want as long as I can service that debt. And I have the cash flow to service that debt. I can have that first 5,000 square foot house, and then I can have a lake house, and I can have an ocean house if I want, and I can have 6 cars and 4 kids and whatever. And when credit's cheap, it's easy to do. We changed as a society from worrying about the debt load that we carried, the country, businesses, and individuals, to could I afford the monthly payments? That's a huge change in the way we think about financial stewardship in this country. We've got to go back and move away from this idea that as long as I can afford it, I can own it. That's not a sustainable model. There's certainly been structural weaknesses in the financial system that have been exposed over the last few years. We have a global, interconnected financial system. It's that simple. And when the mortgage companies started to originate mortgages that were, let's just say, less than prime, and they said, well, we don't need to carry them on our own balance sheet because the wizards of Wall Street have created this wonderful new thing called securitizations. And securitization allows us to spread the risk of that loan across the world, literally, as we came to find out. And so there were all kinds of structural weaknesses in the system that I'll go into a little bit later, but that clearly was one of the causes of the crisis that we're now, well, we're beyond the crisis, but the challenges that we currently have. Our country works best and our economy works best when you have coordinated fiscal policy and monetary policy. We haven't had good, responsible fiscal policy now in decades. This did not start in the last 4 years. It didn't start in the last 8 years. It didn't start in the last 12 years. Probably sometime in the 60s with the Great Society, we ended up starting to spend maybe more than we were taking in. And as a consequence, we have not resolved the structural problems in our overall fiscal situation. And today, they are going to get solved, or they're going to put us under over the next decade or two. So we'll talk more about that as we go through our discussion tonight. I know I'm in an institution of higher learning, so I apologize to all the professors who try hard to make their students understand that hard work gets rewarded. But we changed also as a society from long-term to short-term, from generational thinking to quarterly earnings thinking. And that has had a major effect on how we reward performance, how we think about success. And you all know what I'm talking about. You're talking about the folks who, go to Wall Street and want to make a whole bunch of money, flip a few companies, and retire. Well, to me, that's not necessarily success. That's not sustainable economic activity. That's not a long-term contribution to the long-term success of the country. But we moved from long-term generational thinking to very short-term thinking. I think that's had a profound impact on how we think of ourselves. Lack of moral hazard. That one sounds scary, doesn't it? Basically, this is the too big to fail question. Can a society like ours have institutions that we put on a pedestal, in essence, and say they're too big to fail? Well, I have a simple answer to that. If they're too big to fail, then they're too big to exist. We cannot afford to have the economy held hostage by financial institutions of such size and scale that they can bring down the economy like they did. And the only solution was the lender of last resort had to come in and bail them all out. And you know who the lender of last resort is, don't you? That's us. That's us taxpayers who had to come to their rescue. Now, I run a $14 billion financial institution in Kansas City, Missouri, and I'm proud to say we didn't take TARP, we didn't want TARP, we didn't need TARP. I thought TARP was a terrible policy at the time. Today, I'm a little more reflective. I think it was probably necessary policy, but still terrible policy, quite candid. Because it removes this issue of moral hazard, and it says you can take whatever risks you want because you've got somebody there who's going to backstop you. That's what happened. And we should talk more about that if you have interest in the Q&A. But I can tell you stories about my regulators sitting down with me, a clean, well-run financial institution, and saying, you will take government assistance. and us saying, no, we won't take government assistance. We don't need it. We don't want it. We don't want it. And having to fight with them about not taking government assistance. But we'll talk about that later. And the last one is leverage, leverage, and more leverage. We have leveraged ourselves, we have re-leveraged ourselves, and we continue to leverage ourselves, although we're making a little bit of progress, and I'm going to show you that in just a minute in a few charts. So, I put together this very simple timeline. I went to the St. Louis Fed website, and in the St. Louis Fed website they have this wonderful, probably this thick, literally, diagram of every element of the crisis that we've all undergone over the last few years. And I picked out some of the highlights to talk about a few of them with you today. So let's start with 9/11. Why did I go all the way back to 9/11 to start talking about something that didn't occur till 2007, 2008? Well, let me tell you, I worked for Fidelity Investments in Boston, and I remember 9/11, as we all do, very, very, very vividly. And I remember sitting in my office, and remember 2 of the planes came out of Boston. I remember sitting in my office on a beautiful, clear blue day when a friend of mine came down, or a colleague of mine came down, and he said, you know, little planes hit the World Trade Center. I'm like, interesting. So we had a TV down the hall, so some of us gathered around the TV and began to watch what we all saw unfold in horror. But I remember this day, and I remember turning to Tom, the fellow I was with, and I said, our country will never be the same. Period. It can't be the same. It's going to have to change in ways that I don't even fully understand and you don't even fully understand. But it's going to have to change, because what happened to us is something that we will never really recover from psychologically, and we're going to go into a deep, deep financial difficulty after 9/11. Well, in his great wisdom at the time, Alan Greenspan said, well, I can solve this in one fell swoop. I can make money really, 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 really cheap. And if you recall, he correctly, and I would say correctly, took interest rates off a cliff almost overnight, dropped interest rates considerably over the next year, and allowed the economy to recover quite more quickly than I actually thought it would, to be honest with you, sitting on that day, 9/11 in 2001. But the legacy of those low interest rates really persisted and really didn't show the issues until 2006, 7, and 8. Because what started to happen was, as I described earlier, with easy money, it's easy to take risk and have a reasonable return on your investments. And so we began to see this asset bubble inflation start as early as 2003, 2004. And the United States began to experience tremendous run-up in its asset prices, primarily in financial markets and in housing, primarily, although there were other signs of the asset bubble all around us. And it all culminated in 2007, 2008. So 9/11 wasn't 9/11 the event itself, it's what was done after that, and the persistence of low interest rates for such a long period of time that allowed some of this asset bubble to really build. I remember this event very clearly. I was sitting in, we have a little place on Cape Cod. I was sitting there, and I remember reading the paper, the Wall Street Journal, in like section C, page 47, that had a little article about this mortgage originator called New Century that had failed. And nobody even knows about it. You wouldn't even remember that, but I do, because I remember looking at my wife that day and said, this is the start of the problem. And at the time, in April of 2007, we weren't really, as a society, realizing what was going on underneath the scenes. But it began to become clear to me that this period of low interest rates, this asset bubble we had created, the risk we were taking as a society, was beginning to come home to roost. So President Bush, correctly, when things started to fall off a cliff, signed the Economic Stimulus Act of 2008 to try to get things going. Now, you'll notice most of the events happened in 2008 that I've clustered on this chart. And let me just flip through them and remind us how devastating that year really was. Bank of America purchased Countrywide. I'll never quite understand what Ken Lewis was thinking when he did this, other than I think his ego got ahead of him. IndyMac failed. Biggest bank failure we had had in a long time. Bank of America bought Merrill Lynch. Mother Merrill. Mother Merrill went broke. Anybody know why Mother Merrill went broke? Too much debt, too much leverage, and a bunch of bad securities that weren't worth what they had them on their books for. And when they said, you better write those down because those houses, the collateral behind those notes, aren't worth anything, they didn't have the capital anymore to survive. Lehman Brothers. Now, I remember this day like it was yesterday because I was at my office. Lots of things were going on around September 15th, as you can see from the chart. And some of my guys walked in and said, "It's over." And I said, "It's not over." I said, we got issues, obviously. It's not over. They said, no, it's over. And I said, "What do you mean?" And they said, "No one will trade with anybody else in the debt markets anymore." Because when you trade in the debt markets, of course, you have to exchange collateral, right? You don't just give people money. You have to get something in exchange for it, and typically it's collateral. And the collateral was basically a bunch of bonds that had U.S. home mortgages as the underlying source of repayment, the collateral. And everybody wouldn't trust those mortgages anymore. And so we all sat in my office for hours that day and said, well, what the heck are we going to do? The financial system is about to collapse. Literally, it was about to collapse. And we just decided to stand on the sidelines, not trade with anybody, not move money with anybody. Banks were saying, well, we'll take 110% of the collateral. We think there's a 10% haircut. And we said, no, we're just going to sit on the sidelines, let this work itself out. And it took weeks and weeks for it to work itself out. But I don't think most Americans appreciate how close the system was to collapsing. And it was perilously close. I'll just leave it at that. AIG. This is the one that probably the government will lose the most money on. When it's all said and done, Fannie and Freddie and AIG are the two that are going to cost the government probably $150 to $250 billion when it's all done. AIG was insuring everything. Everybody and everything in a circular fashion. And so when they all started pointing at each other, they realized they were all accountable to each other. There was no real insurance because they were all in this together. They had to bail out AIG. They had to do something. We would have had a cataclysmic event had they not figured out how to bail that out. This next event may seem like not a big deal. This was a huge deal. How many people invest in money market funds? Well, the basic premise of money market funds is you put $1 in, you're going to get $1 back. This fund did something that I had always said in my life, that if a mutual fund breaks the buck, as we call it, and can't support that by its own capital injection, the economy will absolutely fall off a cliff, because the economy and the financial system is based on one word. It's trust. It's trust. And if you put $1 in, you only get 97 cents back. You don't trust the system anymore, and that's when you put money in your mattress. And that started to happen. So look at all the things that happened in September. Bank of America, Lehman Brothers, AIG, the Primary Reserve Fund. And then this next one, which I didn't highlight, really ticked me off. When over a weekend, the investment banks, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, went to the government and said, can you please make us commercial banks so we can get to the Fed window? Because we can't survive if we can't go borrow cheap with the Fed. And so over a weekend, they said, okay, you guys are all commercial banks. Literally. Which means they compete with me and they have an unfair advantage because one, they're backed by the government, and two, they can borrow at the Fed window cheap, and they shouldn't really be able to because they don't really perform commercial banking activities. They perform investment banking activities. And we can talk later, if you want, about whether the provision in Dodd-Frank about separating investment banks from commercial banks is a good idea or not. If you're interested in that, we can talk about that later. Then, of course, Washington Mutual. How many people remember that during this 2-week period of time, that the first time TARP was brought to the floor of the House, it failed? It failed. And it looked like we were back at the precipice and maybe about to fall off the cliff. So it took from September 29th to October 14th to get TARP passed, which, as I said, I hate the legislation, but it was probably the only thing we could have done at the time. And then the auto industry bailout, and then, of course, President Obama signed the Recovery Act in early 2009. Trust me, they will be writing books about this for 100 years. Because what we experienced, hope to goodness we never experience it again, and it had never been experienced before to this level. And I can tell you that the policymakers were making it up as they went along because they didn't know what to do either. I talked to enough of them to know they didn't really know what to do. But they tried some things, and candidly, it actually worked out better than it might have. And you contrast that to Europe, which never dealt with their problems in a constructive and deliberate way, and they're taking a lot longer to get through their problems. And I'm going to talk about Europe in a minute and some of their structural problems. So who do you think this guy is on the right? Well, that's Ben Bernanke. That's Ben Bernanke at 1972, and he was at Harvard. And Ben, as you know, is a student of the Great Depression. And so he was probably the right guy to have in the office at the right time, because he said, I never want to go through the Great Depression again. And he pulled out every stop that he could in order to make sure that didn't happen. We've seen extraordinary monetary policy over the last couple of years. Things, again, they're making it up as they go along. We'll talk about QE1, QE2, QE3. We'll talk about the $40 billion open-ended. We can talk about QE4, or what I call QEOE, QE open-ended. But before we do, you have to look at this chart, which goes back to about 1950. And what this shows, to prove my point about debt and leverage a minute ago, is that the United States has been basically on a debt binge over the last roughly 50 years or so, 60 years. And so what this tries to illustrate is the total amount of debt in our economy that it takes to create $1 of gross domestic product, in essence. So it takes roughly $383 to create $1 of debt, to create $100 in this case, $100 of economic activity, or 3.83 to 1. Think about that. That's in that's in about 2008. But you go back to 1950, and we were a little more than 1 to 1. So we were not leveraged as a society like we are now. Now the good news is you can see the trends start to change. And in essence, what is happening is, of course, consumers are paying down debt big time. They're deleveraging their balance sheets, their household balance sheets. Businesses have paid down a ton of debt, and they're flush with cash, waiting to invest it sometime in the not-too-distant future, I hope. And the only organization that's been re-leveraging while everybody else has been deleveraging is the United States government. Some of it we were forced to do, I suspect, in terms of making sure we didn't fall off a cliff. But the United States government's been re-leveraging the economy even as individuals and businesses have been trying to pay off debt. So it's just an interesting chart. Now look at this just as it relates to households. So that's the whole economy on the other slide. This is just household debt, what you and I have been doing to ourselves over the last couple of years. So for every $1 of economic output, it takes 83 cents in household debt. Think about your own financial situation for a minute. It's not sustainable. It's just not sustainable to carry these levels of debt. And look at the 55-year mean. Households generally leverage themselves about 50%, or a half to 1. And now they're at 83, 85%. You can see we peaked at almost 100%, meaning we had 100% of our assets, if you will, tied up in debt. That doesn't work, folks. So, if Ben can do it, so can I. If he can print money, I guess I can print money. I think that's the view that many people have adopted at this point. And there are really three forces that monetary policy has to work with. There are three things monetarists can do in order to try to improve the economic situation. One, of course, they can drive interest rates to zero, which they've done, and flood the system with liquidity, which they've done. Second, and they made this one up sort of on the fly, they can do what's called asset purchases. They can buy bonds. And we now have a $3 trillion balance sheet for the Federal Reserve. It's about $700, $800 million before we started the crisis. So they've printed money, so to speak, not in a physical sense, but in a virtual sense. They've printed money to buy back our own bonds, to put them in our own treasury. And lastly, the third measure that monetarists can use is the collateralization of loans, which we won't get into. They've tried all of these actions, and they've certainly kept interest rates low, haven't they? I mean, my goodness, as somebody who runs an organization that relies on spread income, the amount we pay you for your money and the amount we get on the loans, that's how we make money, is the spread. It's been very painful. And for the Fed, and I think this is bad policy, by the way, for the Fed to come out and say we're going to keep rates low through 2015, or whatever it is, I think it's a bad idea. I don't think you want to telegraph your next move the way they have. They've basically put a promise out there, and for all the bond traders, they've given them a roadmap to make money. Basically, here's how you make money. We're going to keep rates low for the next couple of years. You can play the arbitrage game. You can play any number of games. I don't like the idea that they tell us what they're going to do 3 years in advance. I don't think that's good policy, quite candidly. So let's talk about QE1, QE2, Operation Twist, Operation Open-Ended, as I call it on the right, and Helicopter Ben. And so what this chart tries to show is in the blue line that's the S&P 500. And the gold or yellow line, the mustard line, I guess, is the CRB Commodity Spot Price Index. So it's the prices of commodities, everything from sugar and corn and oil and gas and all those things that we know are commodities. So the Fed comes out in late 2008 and says, we're going to spend $1.25 trillion to inflate this economy. So by one measure, were they successful? Sure. Look what happened. The S&P returned 35% once they started buying our bonds and putting them in on the Fed's balance sheet. Then they stopped. Look what happened to the equity markets. Started to dip. Then they announced QE2. Look what happened. Asset prices went up. Not surprised. Then they stopped. Then they said, well, we're going to do Operation Twist. And look what happened. And today, of course, I showed the ECB announcement in there. When Mario Draghi over at the European Central Bank said, we're going to defend the euro, we're going to do whatever it takes to make sure the euro doesn't fail, asset valuations went back up. It's kind of interesting how a bunch of guys can say a few things and buy a few things, and look what happens to the equity markets. Kind of fascinating to me. But this really illustrates that by one measurement, quantitative easing, in fact, worked in terms of driving up asset prices. Now, does every American participate in this? No. Heck no. Many of us have 401k plans and those types of things, so you get some benefit, but there are very few people who've actually benefited from this. But it's one of the strategies that he chose to undertake. So this is from Bernanke too, and he says, look, if the fiscal cliff occurs, we don't know what to do. That's basically what that statement says. We don't know what to do. We're going to have to make it all up again. Because here's the problem. These are the elements of the fiscal cliff, as you've read about and you hear about all the time these days. These are the elements of it, right? You hear about the Bush tax cuts. If those go away, that's $150 billion of economic activity that comes out of the economy. If the tax cuts for the wealthy go away, it's 45. You can see how to read it. So if the cliff happens, which it won't, I believe, $670 billion of economic activity comes out of the economy. And $670 billion roughly goes back to the government. That's the way it's going to work, because you're going to pay more taxes primarily. It's going to go back to the government. And you have to ask yourself the question, where would you rather have those resources? Would you rather have those resources in the economy, in private hands, or would you rather have those resources in the government? That's a question. I'm not posing an answer. I'm just giving you a question. So if this happens at the end of the year and the policymakers can't resolve their differences, which I find incredulous, but it could happen, GDP could fall by 4 to 5%. We will be back in a double-dip recession very quickly if they can't resolve this. And as somebody who loans money to lots of companies around the Midwest and around the country, I can tell you that this business owners are sitting on their hands right now doing nothing. They don't know what to do, so they're doing nothing. They want this resolved. Business owners want this issue resolved. So here are 4 scenarios. I'm not going to go through all of them, but if there's no cliff, we think there's a 70% probability of that, roughly. We think GDP will continue to meander along at 1.72%, roughly, something like that. The unemployment rate will hover around 8%. If you see the full cliff scenario, which is the worst case scenario, GDP goes down at least by 0.5%. Unemployment goes back up over 9%. And again, I think the probability of that is low. I don't think the politicians are going to want to have blood on their hands if they allow this to happen. I could be wrong. I could be wrong. There's a lot of gamesmanship that goes on in D.C., but I'm hopeful that they'll figure this out. But if they don't, it's going to be a very, very painful exercise for the country. So let's talk about housing for a second. You can see the averages here over time. This goes back to 1992 on the top in terms of housing starts. And you can see we peaked out in 2006 with almost 2 million, over 2 million housing starts in the country. In order to take care of growth in the population, replacement of housing for natural disasters, immigration, and a few other things, we need about 1.2 million to 1.3 million houses built in the United States every year. Well, we got ahead of ourselves a little bit, and we were building as many as 2.1, 2.2 million houses because why? Money was cheap, leverage was easy, everybody was trading up, right? That $300,000 house, the heck with that, I want $1 million house because I can cash flow it. Oh, what if I lose my job? Forgot about that. What if the economy goes down, the collateral value falls? Forgot about that. Oh, by the way, I forgot that I took out one of those loans that has an arm that resets. I can't afford that in 3 years, but things will be better then. I won't have to worry about it. You get my drift. we were building too many houses to sustain it over a long period of time. You can see what happened. Today we are at a better place than we were, 872,000 houses. We'll probably get to 900,000 new homes in this year. Now, a lot of this, by the way, this improvement has been apartments. It's not a lot of single-family building. A lot of apartments are being built, and I bet if you go around Atlanta now, you're going to see them. They're being built. People don't want to own homes anymore. They don't think it's a good investment. They're not sure the long-term value of their home or a home. So we're seeing a lot more apartments being built around the country. And you can see what's been happening with housing permits as well. I'm going to shift your thinking a little bit, I hope, on this next section, from unemployment to employment. Because when you look at the headline 7.8% number, which is what was announced just a few weeks ago, and we'll have a number tomorrow, and if anybody knows what it is, please tell me. I'd be interested. But I don't know what it's going to be. I think it's going to tick up, to be honest with you, but I don't know exactly what it's going to be. We have 7.8% unemployment. Now, the calculation for unemployment is really simple, right? It's the number of people employed divided by the number of people in the workforce. And so you can improve that number or lower that number one of two ways. Hire more people, have more people in the workforce, or you can shrink the denominator. Either way will work. You'll get a better result in terms of the top line number. But you can see what has happened. The unemployment rate peaked at almost 10%, or a little over 10%, has fallen back to 7.8. I personally see a slowing in the economy right now. I feel it all around me in terms of the borrowers we're working with, the companies we're working with. I personally think it will be a short-term slowdown if we resolve the fiscal cliff issues. If not, we could be in for a very, 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 very difficult time. But the labor force participation rate has been coming down. That's undeniable. There are fewer people in the labor force today than there were many, many years ago. So how do you look at this in terms of employment versus unemployment? So you can see what happened. Look at 08, 9, 10 there. You can see that major fall off, that big V. That's when we were losing 700,000 jobs a month. It was an awful, awful, awful period of time. And we've crawled our way back to adding 150, as much as 200,000 jobs. But with the growth of our population, with some older people being forced back into the workforce because their 401k isn't what it used to be, their CD income isn't what it used to be, what you have is the bottom chart, which shows what I like to call the real or the true unemployment situation in our country. So you see the 7.8% along the bottom, and you see a number of 14.7% at the top. Now that 14.7% is the number called the U6 number. Remember that. There are two numbers you want to ask. What's the unemployment rate? You want to ask two things. What's the U3 number? What's the U6 number? The U3 number is the 7.8. The U6 is the 14.7. The U6 tries to calculate a little bit more broadly what they call not just unemployed workers, but people that are marginally attached to the workforce. They're full-time employable, but they have a part-time job. You have a college education, but you're waiting tables, whatever it might be. You are underachieving relative to your economic potential, and that's a number that we look at. And that happens to be at 14.7. It peaked out at over 16% during the worst of the crisis and has fallen back to 14. You can see a more normal level would be roughly 8% in terms of the U6 number. It's not a new number. It's not one I just made up. The government's been reporting it for quite some time. But those are the two numbers you want to look at. So my point is just, you can look at the headline 7.8 and you can draw a conclusion, or 8.1 or a 6.5. I think when you contemplate that number relative to economic potential for the country, you've got to think about the U6 number, because if you're used to make $100,000 and you're making $42,000, you're not going to spend as much as you would if you were making $100,000. So the ability for consumers to spend, which is 70% of economic growth or economic activity, is obviously suppressed. So just think about that as you consider where we're headed. So Europe. Boy, I could talk for hours on Europe. I'm not going to, I promise. I'm going to run out of time here in a minute. You know, when the European Union was created, it's a great thing. And they created the third largest economic unit in the world. United States number 1, China number 2, Europe number 3, Japan number 4. Those are the 4 largest economic units in the world. There was one big flaw in the treaty, though, I think, that created the European Union, and the European Monetary Union at least, and that's this. They bifurcated, or separated, fiscal policy and monetary policy. And they tried to coordinate monetary policy, but they didn't coordinate fiscal policy very well. And in the treaty, there are agreements that say, Greece, you can't have a debt-to-GDP ratio greater than, pick a number, 12%, 15%. I don't know what the number is exactly. But every country did their own thing. There was no coordination on the fiscal side at all. And yet they tried to coordinate monetary policy through the European Central Bank. It doesn't work. And how do I know it doesn't work? Because it's not working for us right now either. We have fiscal policy that's a disaster, has been for years. We have coordinated monetary policy through the Fed. And if Ben Bernanke were here right now, I think he'd say this to us. He'd say, you know what? He'd say, I'm doing everything I can to save this economy, but I'm not getting any help from the elected side of the aisle. And that's not a hit on Democrats, Republicans, Independents. They're not. We haven't had a budget in 3 years. We have not had a budget in 3 years. Do you realize that? As a country. And so if he were sitting here, he'd say, God, I could use some help from those guys. And I can probably hold this thing together. I'm back on the U.S. now, obviously. I can probably hold the U.S. together, but I can't get us back to a 4, 5, 6% growth rate with all this QE stuff I'm doing. All I can do is make sure it doesn't get any worse. The long-term answer is to solve these fiscal issues alongside coordinated monetary policy, and we'll be in better shape. So my point is, the Eurozone has that problem. They don't have coordination in their policies. They're trying to, and they're trying to figure out who they want to be when they grow up. And I'll make a prediction that they will keep the monetary union together. The European Union will stay together, because to do otherwise would basically make Europe irrelevant. It would make them irrelevant, because every country alone wouldn't be worth much relative to the overall global economic output. And so Germany standing alone, France standing alone, they could do it, but the other members of the Eurozone couldn't do it, and they would become completely irrelevant in the economic fortunes of the globe. So I think they have to hang together. But you can see what's been happening to them. We said earlier they're in recession. There's no question about it. They have about a 0.5% negative growth rate right now, and I suspect they will be there for at least the next 12 to 18 months. So what happens after Draghi makes his comments? You can see Santa Claus there down the bottom. He's just like Bernanke, but he does it for Europe. When he speaks, equity valuations rise. Kind of amazing. He hasn't done anything, by the way. They haven't bought a single bond yet in Europe. They haven't done the QE. They said they would, but they can't get their act together, so they actually haven't bought a lot of the debt from other nations. China. This is, I think it's a very interesting chart. So the blue line shows power consumption in China, electricity usage, which is a leading indicator of what happens in one's economy. And so you look at the blue line, and you can look all the way back to pre-2009, and China was on a roll. I mean, absolutely industrializing the country at a rapid rate. They were on a roll. And you start to look at what happened after our crisis. Of course, China got dragged down as well. Their growth rates have slowed. The yellow bars there is GDP in China. And you're seeing electricity consumption go down again as we're seeing this slowdown in manufacturing. And then secondarily, you'll see Chinese GDP probably flatten out. I don't think it's going to go negative or anything, but I think it'll flatten out at about 6.5, 7%. But it had been growing 10, 11, 12%. That'll be a drag on the global economy. And another way to look at this is rail traffic in China. Same trend. The rail traffic has fallen off a cliff over the last few months. And again, it's probably a harbinger of some slowdown in the Chinese economy. So it's something we like to look at just to sort of get a sense of where the second largest economy on earth is headed. So a couple comments about our outlook, and then I'm going to be quiet and see if you guys have any questions. So I won't go through all this, but if you go all the way over to the right-hand column, you can see that we think the U.S. economy will grow somewhere around 2 to 2.5%. Not enough, not bad enough to be a recession, certainly. Not good enough to probably change the unemployment picture, or should I say the employment picture in the country materially. You know, that number will bounce around. You can see our unemployment numbers. We have roughly 7.75% to about 8.3%, roughly speaking, is where we think unemployment will be. Housing starts, as I said, south of 1 million, better than it had been. You can see the last few years kind of bottomed out at about 500,000 new homes, and we're up to almost 1 million new homes a year. That's good. We think interest rates will stay low, what seems like for forever. At this point, I don't know when they're going to go up. And I just say this one more thing about Ben Bernanke, and I forget if I said this earlier or not. He wrote the book. He wrote the book on quantitative easing back about 10 years ago, before the crisis. He's an academic by training. He used to write papers and such. And he wrote the book, and he said, if our economy ever has these kinds of problems, here's what I'm going to do. He did it. He did the whole QE program. Was already conceived in his mind as a reaction to what might happen. But if he were here tonight, he'd say, but there's one chapter I never wrote. because I don't know the answer. And I don't know how to unwind all this debt that we've created. I don't know how to do it. And I think he'd be honest. And I've heard him speak recently. He's like, I'm not sure what we're going to do yet to unwind it, but we'll figure that out when we get there. How you take a $3 trillion balance sheet and normalize it down to $800 billion or whatever it used to be. So that's worrisome. You can keep rates down forever if you want, and we'll end up like Japan. Japan has had low interest rates for 20 years, and guess what? They've had no growth to speak of for 20 years. Now, we're not Japan. We have net immigration. We're not as old as they are. We don't save as much as they do. That's another issue. But we're not Japan, and I'm not suggesting to you we are. But you can't keep rates low forever, and I can't quite figure out how they're going to unwind it. And when they do, if history's any guide, the shock to the upside is likely to be violent. 1984, I believe it was. I think it was 84. They raised interest rates 7 times in 1 year. 7 times in 1 year to combat inflation. Now, inflation is latent today. There's not a lot of concerns about inflation. Someday that'll change too, probably. Or we are Japan, and I don't accept that. I think we'll get inflation. I think we'll get growth. We'll have to raise rates. If history's any guide, watch out. In the last 8 years, that's not right. Since 2008, if you think about equity mutual funds, there have been 800 billion in outflows in equity mutual funds. There's been 800 billion of inflows into fixed income funds, bond funds. Now, everybody who goes to Clayton State knows the proposition that when interest rates rise, bond values fall. And when interest rates fall, bond values rise, right? Everybody knows that. So what's going to happen to all these people who are sitting on these debt instruments when interest rates rise? Think about that. Okay. And then this is just our global economic forecast. Again, a couple of things I want to point out here. It's very interesting, I think. Look at the far left-hand column. And this is who controls what percent of global economic power. So the United States has roughly 22% of global economic power right now. The Eurozone's 20. You can go work down it. If I showed you this chart 20 years ago, the United States would be about 40% of global economic power. Today it's about 22%. We have to share the wealth, as they say, as India grows up and China grows up and Brazil's growing up and many of these emerging nations are growing up. So today the emerging economies make up 37% of total world GDP or world output. And that was certainly not the case 20 years ago. I can tell you that. It was in the single digits. But they're coming along very nicely. So go all the way to the right. Our overall forecast is for the U.S. to grow roughly 2%. The Eurozone to shrink next year a little bit more. To have Japan basically be flat. They're getting a bounce from the tsunami. You can see that 50 basis points decline in 2011 was really the tsunami that sucked a lot of economic power off the island. But they're growing again, although very, very modestly. So the developed world growing at 120 just won't get it done. It won't turn us around in the U.S. to 4, 5, 6% growth. So just keep that in mind. China's growing at 650, but look where they were growing. The average for the previous 17 years was 10%. So they're slowing. There's no question about it. And the emerging economies are actually doing reasonably well. So I am way over time. Here are the catalysts that I see. These are the things I look at that would cause me to change my outlook one way or the other, either for better or for worse. Rates, of course, we watch that daily. Quantitative easing, how much, when. This $40 billion forever really has me worried. But I'm going to give you a clue. I think quantitative easing, $40 billion a month for as long as the eye can see, will happen until one of two things happens, or maybe both. Probably both have to happen. I think they will do everything they can to keep the economy afloat by buying bonds until unemployment is 7% or less, or they see inflation at 3% or more. And until the 7.3 we call it, 73, until those two things happen, you're going to see us have easy money, flood the system with easy money, low interest rates, and they'll keep the QE programs coming until we have those sort of levels. I don't know how to get off the drug of low rates. I honest to goodness don't know how to get off the drug. It's like morphine. It makes the pain go away, but the underlying disease is still there. We've got to deal with the disease, and those are some of the fiscal issues that I talked about. The election, I'm going to let that stand, and you guys can think about that. The cliff we've talked about, oil prices, they've fallen in the last few days. There's tremendous demand destruction going on right now in the northeast part of the country. 22% of our GDP comes from the part of the country that's been impacted by the big storm. So there's demand destruction right now. We'll get some of that back in future quarters, but it's going to hurt for a while. Markets, unemployment. The Middle East is a tinderbox, obviously. After one of the two men become our president, we will need to deal with the Israeli-Iranian problem, or Israel will deal with it one way or another. I don't know what that looks like, but that's going to have to get dealt with, and if it gets dealt with the wrong way, that would be a terrible shock to the system. And corporate earnings have looked pretty good. They've looked pretty good the last couple of years, but what you're beginning to see now, and you start this quarter particularly, is top-line revenue is not growing. And companies were making their bottom line on expense reductions. And now the top line's not growing and they're running out of tricks to cut cost. And so we're seeing some compression in earnings growth for corporate America. At the end of the day, we could argue for hours what drives the stock market. Really there's one thing, and it's called corporate earnings. And so keep an eye on earnings. Earnings are beginning to decelerate, and that's a little bit of a worry. So these are the kind of things I'm looking at, thinking about day in and day out to kind of gauge where we are. And I'm going to wrap it up with this quote: democracy is indeed doomed once the citizens realize they can vote themselves other people's money. And of course, this was Voltaire from many years ago. So I'll leave it with that, close with that. Now, that was a lot of information for you to absorb, and it is what it is. I've already done it, so I can't undo it. I know that was a lot of information, and I'd love to take your questions if you have any. Yes, sir. Yeah, I know. I buy U.S. Treasuries, but go ahead. With a balance sheet like that, who would?
What happens when the rest of the world realizes it?
Yeah, so that's the right question, right? And we all know China and Japan and Middle Eastern nations and the Caribbean nations all hold our debt. We know that. One day, I think they will come to the realization that, you know what, the United States is a higher risk than it used to be. The rating agencies already said that. They downgraded our debt. And they might do it again. If we don't get the fiscal cliff issues resolved, the debt will get downgraded yet again. No question about it. And then I think what happens is rates start rising rapidly. Because interest rates are, what are they really, right? It's a risk premium. Rates are low when risks are low. Rates go high when risks are high. And so I suspect what happens is if China or other big lenders of ours, and they are lenders, they are buying our debt, if they push away from the table or they demand a higher rate, then rates move up very, very quickly. And that would be devastating to the economy. China is also a very interesting study because in many respects, China is shifting right now from exports driving their economy to internally generated demand beginning to drive their economy. And as they modernize and as they get more wealth, their hope is that, and this will happen over the next 2 decades, I'd suggest, they will have more internal demand and they won't need to export as much. And that's the point at which this very tenuous relationship between China and the U.S. could break down, where they basically say, you know what, we don't like your debt anymore, and we don't need your exports anymore, at least as much as we used to. And so maybe we need to get paid more, or we're just going to stop buying it. So the risk is that our creditors say, I'm not buying a 10-year Treasury at 1.5%. It's 1.71 today. Think about that. Think about that for a minute. Hold a bond for 10 years and get 1.7%. That's what we're telling our creditors to do. And if you believe that the risks in our economy or our system are growing, they won't stand for it. Rates will have to rise to meet that issue. Is there a question, Mary? Oh, yeah. How much time do you have? Investments, yeah.
Financial banks,
yep.
security banks were allowed to use together. Do you think that was a good idea?
Oh, it's easy to look back now, isn't it? I know this, that Glass-Steagall served the country pretty well from the 30s until it was repealed in the 90s. And in 10 short years, the bankers screwed it up. And we allowed investment bankers to, marry commercial bankers. And in 10 years, they created these synthetic products, they created these crazy things, and they risked, this is the problem, they risked the capital of the commercial bank on the investment bank. And they speculated. And investment banks, by definition, are speculative. That's what they do. They have trading accounts. They underwrite debt and equity and things such as that. Commercial banks are supposed to make loans prudently, protect the depositor, the person who puts the money in. That's what you're supposed to do as a bank. Protect the depositor first, make a loan second. And those two may not be compatible with each other. So candidly, yes, I would favor a repeal of it and go back to something akin to Glass-Steagall, where if you're going to be a speculative organization, that's no problem. I have no problem with that. But go to your shareholders and say your capital's at risk, and that's what we are. We're a speculative organization. And if you're going to be a commercial bank, then your investors ought to know, what your risk profile is. Putting the two together just muddied the waters, I think, way too much. And again, I think the bankers screwed it up over the last 15 years. So yeah, I think going back to some separation is probably right. That is not a universally shared belief, but from a practical standpoint, we've proven we can't seem to handle it, so maybe we need to separate it again. Yes?
One question, piggybacking on Professor Moreland's observation that the United States is not a very good customer, you don't want to lend money, and so to make it a better customer, from what I hear you say, deleveraging is the path to take.
Yep.
But deleveraging will reduce economic activity to a certain extent. And so, what is your guesstimation on the fine line of how much reduction you can take in order to achieve the deleveraging?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's a conundrum. And I'm not sure I have an exact, formula that I can give you. I can tell you this, that one of the reasons we got in the problem that we got into is we overconsumed and we didn't save enough as a society. We overbuilt and we overbought, and we didn't have the resources to pay for those obligations that we created for ourselves. So I don't know that I have an exact answer, but I know this: consumers can't carry the debt they've been carrying. They need more cash flow, and it's not coming because guess what? Employers aren't giving a lot of raises right now. They can hold the line on raises, and so people's incomes aren't rising. And when incomes aren't rising, you're going to have to lower your debt load or something, or you're going to end up in trouble. So I think you're exactly right. There is a fine line between too much deleveraging too fast and not enough deleveraging so that we can afford the things that we all have. I think the actual pace we've gone through so far has been about right, believe it or not. Now, some people have been forced to deleverage just because they lost their job and they couldn't afford the home anymore. There's a lot of foreclosed homes still around that need to be cleaned up before we can call the housing market finally resolved. There are a lot of assets still hanging around that are overpriced that have to come down. Everybody remember the old guy by the name of Adam Smith? Remember him? Well, he had this very simple idea about supply and demand and how the two create equilibrium with each other, right? It's very, very simple. When you have an oversupply and not enough demand, what happens? And when you have too much demand and not enough supply, prices go up, right? So right now we're in an oversupply, under demand, less demand. Prices have got to come down. And prices on houses and assets have been coming down. And that, I don't know if we're at the equilibrium point yet. We're closer. We're a lot closer where risk takers will say, I'm willing to buy that house at that price. I wasn't willing to buy it at that price, but I'm willing to buy it at that price. So it's an inexact answer to a very difficult question. It needs to happen. It is happening. The charts show that it's happening. Do I think we need to go back to the 1950s where nobody had any debt and everybody paid on cash? No. Debt is a very useful instrument. Overused, it can be devastating, though. Yeah.
Peter, thank you for your message. I've not heard the description of the last 30 years more eloquently than you did tonight. Thank you for that.
Sure. Thank you.
One thing you did not mention, and curiosity's really got me as to your feelings about this, and that is our federal government is so large, and over the last 30 years we've allowed it to get out of hand.
Yeah.
What is your feelings about what we could and should do with the size of our federal government and in the overall big picture? How much of a difference does that make?
So if you look at the percentage of GDP that is occupied by the federal government, the government generally, I'm going to broaden your question a little bit, state government, local government, federal government, it's been growing precipitously. In fact, I don't have that chart in here, but I probably should have used it, where I actually show the percentage of GDP that's attributable to government entities, and it's the fastest growing part over the last 25, 30 years has been federal spending. Businesses haven't grown that fast, it's been federal spending. And you could argue about whether that was money well spent or not. I'm not going to get into that discussion. The federal government needs to, just like you and I do, be able to say, I've got a budget, we haven't had one in 3 years, I've got a budget and I can live within those means. And I think our federal government has tried to do maybe a little too much. It's just gotten a little bit too big. But my other observation on it is, how many people give to nonprofits? We all do. In some form or another, every one of us gives back our time, our talent, our treasure, something like that. Well, there's a rule in not-for-profit giving, and you could tell with my introduction I've done a lot of this. There's a rule about efficiency, and it says if 90% of every dollar you give isn't going back to the cause at hand that you're giving to, don't give it. Because it means the organization's too fat, they're too heavy, they're inefficient. Don't give it to it. Now, some will say the number is 85. I like to reach for 90. But the vast preponderance of what you give, you want to go to that problem, solve that problem. The problem with our federal government and the way it's gotten so large is that it becomes wholly inefficient as an allocator of capital. And so we take our capital in the form of taxes, send it to these various government agencies, and then they don't get 90% efficiency with that. They might get 20% or 10% because you have a lot of overhead. And as a business person, you need a certain amount of overhead, but we have to ask ourselves the question, how much overhead can the country afford? Because the federal government's overhead. I mean, that's what it is. It doesn't create revenue, really, its own revenue. It uses our revenue for its purposes and our purposes, ultimately. So it's a question of right-sizing it for revenues to fit expenses and debt service. Oh, by the way, my other thing, which I didn't say tonight, which I fully believe why rates will be low for 3 to 5 years, is because we have to service the debt. It's one of the biggest lines in the federal budget, right, is debt service. And so if those rates go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 6 to 7, our budget situation gets exponentially worse. Exponentially worse. And so that's a real worry that Bernanke has and the government has just generally. But the answer to your question is, we should be thinking about it like a business, which is, I have a certain amount of revenue and I have a certain amount of expense, and I need to get more efficient every day. More efficient. And my view is that, well, I'm happy to send my portion to all the governmental agencies that come ask for it. I really am. I sure as heck would like it to be more efficient. And before I send more used inefficiently, I'd like what I'm already sending to be used more efficiently. And if we could figure that out, then I think Americans will pay whatever it takes to sustain our system. But in the absence of that, there's a lot of skepticism about why I'd want to send more to an organization that's pretty inefficient. So I don't know if that answers it, but he's taking me to dinner, so I've got as long as you want. Jerry?
Comment about the small business. I mean, our country is built on small business. Is the future of small business they've got to go to government, or can they come to the banks if they have to?
Small business, it is certainly the lifeblood of the economy. There's no question about it. I know it's a cliche. You hear it in all the political advertisements, but it's true. In fact, there's a study out by the Kauffman Foundation in Kansas City that suggests that all net new job creation in the last 10 years has been created by companies with less than 50 employees. We know that to be true. Big companies strive for efficiency. Small companies strive for growth. It's true. Small companies are adding people generally. Bigger companies tend to have to be more efficient. They tend to be public companies, earnings announcements, and all that good stuff. The government plays a very important role in supporting and sustaining small business. I'd be the first to tell you that the Small Business Administration does great things for companies that are on the margin. They're not bankable yet by a bank like us, but they've got reasonably good financials, and they need a bridge from the point where they are to the point where a financial institution can take them on. So there's a role for the government, certainly, in supporting smaller businesses and sustaining smaller businesses. I think when it gets tricky for me is when the mandates are put in place. So, we start to get mandates like, you will make these kinds of small business loans with this risk profile. And we'll reject that. We'll say, no, we'll do every good loan that comes over the transom that meets our credit quality characteristics and that we want to have in our own portfolio. Because we never securitize stuff to other people. That's passing the trash, in my opinion. If it's good enough for our portfolio, then darn it, we're going to house it. So I think the answer is the government can play a very strong role in small business administration. They can make sure regulations are reasonable and proportional to the size of the business. They've done more of this recently. I'll give them credit. They've given exemptions to smaller business on certain requirements, which I think is wise. But no, we're not a country that's ever going to look to the government to build our economy. That would be a flawed economic model. We need to look to ourselves. We're Americans after all. And I feel like I've left you guys on some dour notes, so I'm going to leave you on an up note, which is this. This is the greatest country ever conceived. It's the greatest economy that's ever been created. The future, in many respects, is in our past. It's in our entrepreneurs. It is. It's in the risk takers. It's in people who put their own capital up and say, I believe in this idea so much that I'm willing to risk my own capital. And we need to support those people, make sure that they're held up as the heroes of society. Don't get me started on why sports figures are heroes and entrepreneurs aren't. Don't get me going, okay? Because you're talking to the guy who's trying to make Kansas City America's most entrepreneurial city. That is literally the objective we have for our community, and we're working hard to do that. This is still the greatest thing ever created. It's imperfect, totally imperfect. Let's recognize that. But it's still the best chance, human beings have ever had to achieve their lifelong objectives. And the government can't and shouldn't do that. It should support it, but it shouldn't try to interfere.
Peter, on behalf of the faculty and the students and the staff of the College of Business, this is a little token of appreciation for you coming out to visit with us. Thanks so much.
Thank you. That was great.
Yeah.
Thank you. What are 7?
But the rest of our guests and faculty, please join us for the reception. Thank you all for coming. This has been great.
That was a little long-winded.
Go to class.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
So many questions.